Well, welcome to this next session on Ecclesiastes, searching for the meaning of life. We left off last time in the middle of chapter 7, and at the end where Solomon tells the reader that there's days of prosperity and there are days of adversity, and that both are made by God. And he finishes up a whole series of proverbial sayings with that conclusion. Now we're going to pick up where we left off, but exciting for this next section is that Solomon actually makes some progress in his quest and helps us to understand a little bit more about what all of this is leading toward. So let's get into chapter 7. We're going to pick up where we left off, and it'll be starting in verse 15. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 15. If you have your Bibles, please turn there, or you can see the text on the screen. Verse 15 says, "I have seen everything in my days of pointlessness. A righteous man perishes in his righteousness, and a wicked man lives long in his evil doing." So Solomon is saying that he's seen everything, all this pointlessness that is happening. And one particular case he brings back up yet again, and this is not a new point he's made. It's about injustice. This seems to be so perplexing to him. He says, a righteous man perishes in his righteousness, but on the contrary, a wicked person lives a long life in their evil doing. How does that make any sense? So Solomon is scratching his head at this issue of injustice that he sees in the world. Now, according to traditional wisdom, righteousness is supposed to result in a long life, and wickedness is supposed to result in a shortened life. We see this in the book of Proverbs, which expresses a lot of traditional wisdom. For example, in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, it says, "My son, do not forget my instruction, and let your heart guard my commandments, for they will add to you length of days, years of life, and peace." And also in verse 16 of chapter 3, "In her," meaning in wisdom's right hand, "is length of days, and in her left hand are riches and glory." And yet again, in chapter 9, verse 11, "For by me," by wisdom, "your days will be multiplied, and years of life will be added to you." So what Solomon is saying is that he doesn't see this happening. He sees the opposite. He sees righteous people dying early. Of course, everybody dies, but he's saying they're perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked people are actually getting to live long lives. So, what is his follow-up logic then? Well, in verse 16 and 17, he asks two questions about this. He gives two instructions and then asks two questions. He says, "Do not be excessively righteous and do not be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be excessively wicked or be a fool. Why should you die before your time?" So if the issue here is that Solomon sees this injustice happening, the question would be then, what's the benefit of being righteous and being wise? And what's the detriment then of being wicked or being a fool? If you get to live a long life and be wicked versus be righteous and live a short life, it would seem like, well, maybe wickedness is actually better then. But Solomon says neither one's better than the other. Do not be excessively righteous and do not be overly wise. And then he says, do not be excessively wicked and don't be a fool. He says, don't be either one of these. Why should you destroy yourself trying to be righteous, or why would you die before your time trying to be wicked? Now, this logic seems to be completely contradictory. It's probable that Solomon is here, he's trying to express his frustration at what he sees happening in the world around him. And that if being on one end or the other end of the spectrum, if neither one of those is really, the answer, then perhaps moderation is the answer. Maybe a little bit of both. Now, destroying yourself here in verse 16, he's talking about overexerting oneself to try to be scrupulous in their righteousness. You could almost say that this might even borderline on a legalism of sorts. And then the wicked person or the fool, why should you die before your time? It seems like he's hearkening back to traditional wisdom again, where wickedness does cut one's life short. So then why would you be excessively wicked or foolish? Because then you're probably going to die early. Now, these two propositions by Solomon seem to kind of stand in conflict with each other. And if neither category really results in what one might expect, then perhaps trying to live strenuously on one end or the other really isn't the answer, but to accept that both are part and parcel of life. Now, putting these two in tension together, though, he's not suggesting that whatever happens between the two extremes is completely permissible and valuable and is an all right way to live. Really, Solomon's just logically applying the case here to the injustice. That if injustice doesn't work itself out in the way that one might think, then perhaps that's not the right answer, and there's a different answer that should be considered. But he doesn't really give us what that answer is. He just kind of poses this tension together of moderation on both righteousness and wickedness as though that is supposed to suffice. So as readers, we're kind of left still puzzled a little bit as to what really is his point in trying to say that moderation might be the middle road that one should go. So we have to live with that tension as he does not resolve it for us. But he moves on, and let's do the same. He goes to verse 18. It is good that you grasp the one thing, but do not withdraw your hand from the other. For the one who fears God will come out from both of them. He adds on to the problem that we're facing here by saying that it's not good to grasp one and then not the other. Why? Because the person who fears God, he even goes to the person who fears God, not just a generic person. This is the person who's supposed to be the ideal person. They will come out from life, so to say, with both of them. What he's trying to point out here is that everybody, even the God-fearer, the person who lives before God and obeys God and submits to God's authority, they too will come out of life with both righteousness and wickedness in their hand. He is completely subverting the traditional wisdom, like what we read about in the book of Proverbs, based upon observation. And we're going to see as we go on that Solomon would begin to understand that his observational data is actually really not the best basis or foundation for answering the question that he's been seeking the whole time. This is similar, what Solomon is doing here is similar to kind of what Paul does in the New Testament. And in verse 19 here and 20, he goes on, now Solomon shifts a little bit. He gives just another traditional proverb. Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Surely there is not a righteous person on earth who does good and does not sin. So coming out of life with both, meaning both righteousness and wickedness, he then is just making kind of an axiom here that essentially nobody is completely righteous and has not done any sin, but is only good. This is what Paul writes about in Romans chapter 1, where he talks about Jews and the Gentiles both being guilty before God. He says that there's not one righteous, not even one. He quotes this from Psalm 14. And so he goes on to say that everybody at some point in their lives have gone astray, have rebelled against God, have not sought God. They've all fallen short of God's glory. They have not attained to the perfect status and the perfect standard by which God desires his creation to live. And so Solomon here is pulling that wisdom and that principle into the mix, that it's wisdom that does give a person strength, but even the wise person is not wholly wise and is not wholly good. The wise person has both good and sin. So it can't be that just being wise solves the problem, because the wise person also participates in this enigma of life that he sees in the world, where righteous people don't get what they should and wicked people don't get what they should. And then in verse 21, also, Solomon says, "Do not take to heart every word that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For your own heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others." Solomon moves to give an example of how a wise person is not completely good without sin. For take example, a wise person listening to his servants talk, that at some point the servants will chide the master or curse the master, say things under their breath about him or her. And then he follows up to say, but in your own heart, you're also guilty of that. He says, you know many times you yourself have cursed others. His example consists here of being overly attentive to what other people say about you, but then not really understanding that you yourself have committed the same sin in your heart. But the idea is really, it's not about the curse, it's about the hypocrisy. I think as broken humans, we all tend to sometimes play the victim card when other people say things about us. All the while, we're ignoring our own faults within us, and we might demonstrate then the same behavior toward others, but yet not perceive it as such. I'm sure we've probably all come to the same realization that we are guilty of this hypocrisy at some point in our lives. Maybe when somebody said something about us, we have also said that same type of thing about somebody else. I'm not sure if this instance is any more true than maybe when we're in a car. We're riding in a car. If you're the driver and you're driving in the car, and somebody in the passenger seat or somebody in the back seat, they tell you what you should be doing, whether how you're driving or where to go or whatever it is, but you're driving and they're shouting at you on what to do, and you just want them to stop. You want them to just quit it and let you be the driver. Well, I think maybe, I don't know, has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me plenty of times. And then what about if you're in a car and you're not driving? And you're sitting in the back seat. And you just don't think that the person sees that they need to turn up ahead, or they don't see the car coming on the right, or they just need them to drive faster or something. And you shout up at them, and you tell them how to drive. And then they get upset at you because you're telling them how to drive. And then you're like, dude, come on. I'm just telling you what to do. It's not a big deal. But when you were in that seat, it was a big deal. and you seem to get just as irritated as they're getting. But we never attribute that as such usually, because we always kind of look at things through our own filter. If we like something like a certain way, or we think it should be done a certain way in life, we usually don't mind telling someone that. We don't mind the information going out from us. But in reverse, we tend to not like people telling us how to do something if we have a preferred way of doing it already, or if we have a preference about it. You see, when the shoe is on the other foot, a lot of times we don't see the double standard by which we're currently living. And that's the hypocrisy here that Solomon is trying to bring out. That even the wise person will be caught in the double standard of hypocrisy in their life. And so being wise isn't a complete answer to the issue. Now, he's not deprecating wisdom totally. He's just looking at how wisdom plays itself out in the world, and that wise people are also part of this dichotomy of righteousness and wickedness. It's not all or nothing. There's a blend, and every person is part of that mix. Let's move on to verse 23, and Solomon's going to now shift into another section here. He's going to be talking about wisdom, but he's going to now expand on the idea about having wisdom and can somebody actually attain wisdom? Really? So he says, I have tested all this with wisdom. So his entire pursuit and investigation about the meaning of life, he says he has done with wisdom. I've tested it according to wisdom. I used wisdom as I was carrying out my inquiry. And I said, I will be wise. But it was beyond my reach. That which is beyond reach and deep. Deep. Who can find it out? This is the first admission of Solomon of his own limitations. That he's using wisdom, but he doesn't really mean wisdom in like the way that we probably think he does, because he uses the word for wisdom in a couple different ways. And here, it's not like divine wisdom. It's not the wisdom that you get from like the book of Proverbs and other wisdom literature. Wisdom here is essentially, he's saying, I used my rational faculties of mind. I used reason and logic. And I approached everything from that vantage point and with that framework. And he says, I will be wise. Meaning he wants to carry out his inquiry in the right way. He doesn't want to have flaws. He doesn't want to have weaknesses in his pursuit of the answer about the meaning of life. But he found out that he actually couldn't do it. He couldn't actually be wise in the way that he wanted to be wise. He could use reason and logic, but the true wisdom by which he knew he needed in order to get the answer, he says, it's unachievable. I couldn't find it. It is beyond my reach, and it is deep, deep. Like going to the bottom of the ocean. It's just out of his ability to acquire. And he asks rhetorically, like, who can find it out? The implied answer is basically nobody. He's thinking like, if I did everything I could, and I tried to be wise, and I used my mind and applied it in the best way I could, and I couldn't get to wisdom, real wisdom, then who can? I mean, it's a little arrogant of a statement for Solomon, but he's honestly saying, like, I don't know who can find it. It's hidden. It's deep and deep beyond reach. And then he also backs it up by saying, I turned my heart to know and to search and to seek wisdom. He's reaffirming just the complete intensity of effort and diligence with which he applied himself to his quest. He went to know and to search and to seek. mean, these are all kind of synonymous expressions, but this triplet is just extra intensified to say that he sought wisdom and the reason for things. He sought the answer to the meaning of life. But not only that, he also sought to know wickedness of folly and the foolishness of madness. He sought to look at everything under the sun. He didn't leave anything out. So that's his approach. Now he says in verse 26 what he found. I find, so he's giving an admission of a discovery that he made. I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets and whose hands are chains. Whoever pleases God will escape from her, but the sinner will be captured by her. Solomon is saying that he has found a woman, but it's not the type of woman that you think. It's not the woman he's looking for. Likely, this is an allusion to a personified attribute of foolishness as a woman, which is found in the book of Proverbs, and I think we'll read a couple of those. But the idea in Proverbs is that there are two characters. There's Lady Folly or Lady Foolishness, and there's Lady Wisdom. And these two personified attributes are described in anthropomorphic terms of doing things and saying things. And here, the woman that's more bitter than death and whose heart is snares and nets and whose hands are chains, this imagery is very reminiscent of Lady Folly in Proverbs. For example, in chapter 9 of Proverbs, regarding Lady Folly, it says, starting in verse 13, Lady Folly is boisterous, lacking in understanding, and does not know anything. And she sits at the entrance of her house on a throne at the heights of the city, calling out to those passing by on the road, to the ones making their paths straight. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here, she says to the one lacking sense. Stolen waters are sweet, and food eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there. The ones who have accepted her invitation are in the depths of Sheol. That those who turn in to Lady Folly become captured by her, ensnared by her, and they find that the dead are in her house. That those who go into her house go into the depths of Sheol, which they go into the grave. So the idea that Solomon is using here, I think, is drawing on this type of personified attribute of Lady Folly from Proverbs. And it's not just this one reference. We'll see again, it'll come up in the next section here. But he goes on to say, and this is only one of the rare places where it actually quotes the sage, which we're presuming to be Solomon for the sake of convention, that this is actually a quotation of his very words. Behold, I have found this, says the sage. Adding one thing to another to find out the reason for things, that my soul is still searching for, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I have found, but I have not found a woman among all those. In verse 27, the adding one thing to another here, he's giving sort of like a description of this is his logical rigor at work. It's like he followed all the steps, dot after dot after dot, just connecting them all. He added one thing onto another, very systematic, methodologically. So he's trying to explain that his investigation and analysis were done so carefully. He did everything step by step, not missing any details or data, because he wants to find out the reason for things, the meaning of life. But he says, my soul is still searching for it, and I have not found it. He's come up empty-handed, he's saying. After all of that effort, Solomon is admitting, I got nothing, guys. This is what I found. I did all of this. I did step after step after step. I was careful. I was thorough. And what I was searching for, I still haven't found it. It's eluding me. Now he says, one man among 1,000 I have found, but I have not found a woman among all those. Now this is not a sexist statement here. He's not saying he can find a man among 1,000, but then there's no woman. He's talking about, I can find a person in 1,000 people. I am that good. I am so shrewd and attentive to detail and observant, I can find one person among 1,000. But the woman I'm searching for, Lady Wisdom, I can't find her. I searched and I can't find her. This Lady Wisdom that he's looking for, I want to read here. Proverbs chapter 1 is where it starts with Lady Wisdom and the personification of wisdom here. In verse 1 it says, Lady Wisdom has built her house. She's carved out her 7 pillars. She's slaughtered her meat. She's mixed her wine. Indeed, she's prepared her table. She's sent out her female servants. She calls out from the tops of the heights of the town. Whoever is naive, let him turn in here. To the one lacking sense, she says, come, eat my food and drink the wine that I have mixed. Leave your naive ways and live. Go straight ahead on the road of understanding. Comparing the woman that Solomon found, the woman that was more bitter than death, and the one whose hands were chains and had snares and nets to entrap him, that's the woman he found. He didn't find this other woman. He didn't find Lady Wisdom. But she was the one that he was trying to find. He was seeking wisdom. He wanted to be wise. And he said he used wisdom, but it wasn't the wisdom that Lady Wisdom was offering. It was his own rationality, his own reasoning. He was using his senses to try to gain understanding and knowledge. And then now let's look at the closing verse of this section. Behold, I have found only this. So he's not just saying I found I have found only this. It's almost like he's excluding any other conclusion that he might have come to. He says, God made humankind upright, but they search for many schemes. What's he saying here? How is this really important? Well, previously, Solomon said, like in chapter 1, that everything is bent. The world is bent, it's broken, and nobody can straighten it. What is crooked cannot be made straight. And then previously, in the last session, in chapter 7, in verse 13, Solomon said that God made the world crooked and that no one can straighten it. But now he admits here that the blame for the problem of the world being crooked is not on a work of God, but on the scheming of humankind. The world is crooked, he says, because humans search for many schemes. He says, God made humankind upright. The Hebrew word for upright is the same word as straight. God made humankind straight. But something about humans in our heart and in our desires, we went pursuing after our own schemes. And in doing that, the world has become a crooked place. Now, there's probably a lot of allusions that we could go through here with the Garden of Eden and with Adam and Eve and the desire to have the knowledge of good and evil and to be like God. Those temptations and desires are present within every human being. Every human person has that brokenness from the fall in them. And so Solomon finds here that the one thing he has discovered is that the way that the world is now is our own fault or our own doing. He's almost like he's exonerating God because his framework of observational data previously was that, well, if God, is the one who has ordered everything and all of creation is a work of God, then ergo, well, it seems like the way that the world is then is the way that God made the world to be. That's his deduction. But here he's undoing that logic. He's come to understand there's a little bit of a fault in his methodology. And we'll learn more about that fault in the next section. But here, to close, as one scholar put it, Solomon has found that his own search for wisdom, by wisdom or with wisdom, is merely his own particular version of humanity's scheming, which distorts God's creation of humankind as originally straight. So we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back, and we'll begin chapter 8 and continue on with the journey of Solomon in his quest for the meaning of life.